The moment my grandson's fiancée pressed $100 bill into my shirt pocket and told me to grab something from the buffet line like the rest of the help, I didn't flinch. I didn't pull the money back out. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and I thought, "Sweetheart, you just made the last mistake you'll ever make in front of me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of man walks into a ballroom carrying 60 years of silence. My name is Walter Gaines. I drove a 2004 Chevy Silverado with a cracked dashboard and a passenger side mirror held on with electrical tape. I wore a sport coat I bought at a Dillard's clearance rack in 2009. My hands were thick and calloused, the kind that come from 35 years of hauling freight on the docks before I quietly shifted into buying the companies that owned those docks. I never talked about money. Not to neighbors, not to old friends, not to my grandson Caleb's mother, my daughter-in-law Renee, who had spent the better part of a decade telling Caleb I was just a worn-out old longshoreman who smelled like diesel fuel and had no business interfering in their family's trajectory. Caleb was 29. He was kind-hearted, a little too eager to please, and somewhere in the last 2 years, he had stopped returning my calls. The girl responsible for that was Madison Aldcroft. The invitation to their engagement party arrived in a standard white envelope. No personal note inside, just a printed card with gold script, an estate address in Newport, Rhode Island, and a handwritten addition at the bottom, in red ink, Renee's handwriting. Dress appropriately, Walter. This crowd doesn't do rustic. I ironed my sport coat. I polished my boots. I drove 4 hours north with a hand-carved walnut picture frame in my passenger seat. I'd spent 3 weeks making it in my garage workshop, fitted with a photograph of Caleb at age 7, standing on the bow of my first freighter with his arms spread wide like he was flying. I thought she might want to know who she was marrying into. I was wrong about a lot of things that evening. I was dead right about that one. The Aldcroft estate sat on a bluff above Narragansett Bay, the kind of property where the lawn looked like it was vacuumed twice a week. 2 valets rushed toward the circular drive before I'd even killed the ignition. The younger one reached my door, saw the cracked dashboard, and visibly deflated. He handed me a ticket stub without making eye contact. I took my time getting out. I straightened my jacket. I breathed in the salt air, the same salt air I'd breathed on working waterfronts for 4 decades, and it settled me down to my bones. The party was already in full swing on the terrace. 200 people in designer everything, champagne flutes catching the late afternoon light, a string quartet playing near the hedgerows. Renee found me before I made it through the French doors. "Walter." She said my name the way you'd say a minor inconvenience. She was wearing a blue gown that probably cost more than my first truck, and she was looking at my sport coat with the specific expression of someone who has just noticed a grease stain on a white tablecloth. "Caleb said you might actually come." "He's my grandson," I said. "Yes." She left a long pause there, like she wanted me to feel the weight of it. "Madison's family is their significant people, Walter. Her father is Douglas Aldcroft. You probably haven't heard of him." I had heard of Douglas Aldcroft. Douglas Aldcroft had borrowed $40 million from a consortium that included 2 of my holding companies to finance a waterfront development project in Savannah, Georgia, 3 years earlier. The project was 6 months behind schedule and the debt covenants were starting to strain, but I kept my face pleasantly blank and said, "Is that right?" Renee steered me toward a corner table near the kitchen entrance, the same move, the same dark corner, the deliberate placement that says stay out of the way without saying a word. I sat down, folded my hands, and I watched. The Aldcroft family operated like a machine. Douglas held court near the bar, backslapping and laughing too loud, the performance of a man who needed to be seen more than he needed to be heard. His wife, Cheryl, worked the room in careful circles, dispensing air kisses and appraising jewelry with her eyes. And Madison was the apex of the whole structure. She was beautiful. There was no question about that. And she carried herself with the total confidence of someone who had never once been told no. Caleb orbited her. That's the only word for it. He didn't walk alongside her. He orbited always a half step behind, always watching her face to calibrate his own expression, always slightly braced, like a man waiting for a correction. I watched that for 20 minutes before I went looking for him. I found him near the bar, and the change in him when he saw me was something I still think about. There was a flicker genuine, warm, The little boy on the freighter bow, and then it closed over like ice on a pond. Grandpa? He shook my hand instead of hugging me. You made it. Of course I made it. I pulled the wrapped picture frame from under my arm. Brought you something. He looked at the package, then quickly looked over his shoulder. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. He took it without unwrapping it and held it awkwardly at his side. And before either of us could say another word, Madison appeared. She materialized the way certain people do, not walking into a conversation so much as arriving into it, taking possession of the space. You must be Walter, she said. She looked me over with a smile that never reached her eyes. Caleb talks about you. The pause she left after that was almost artistic. Occasionally. He talks about you too, I said, constantly. She didn't like that. The smile stayed, but something behind it went cold. She reached out and touched the picture frame in Caleb's hand. What's this? A gift, I said. From my workshop. She took it from Caleb's hand without asking, turned it over, read the paper wrapping like it might tell her something useful, and handed it back with a little laugh. Oh, how sweet. Homemade. She said it the way you'd say how unfortunate. We're actually working with an interior designer for the new place. Everything is very curated, but we'll find a spot for it somewhere. Caleb said nothing. She looked at my jacket, my boots, the rough terrain of my hands. Then she reached into the small clutch purse at her wrist, produced a crisp $100 bill, and tucked it into my breast pocket with 2 fingers, like she was tipping a parking attendant. She patted the pocket twice. The food stations are incredible tonight, she said. Make sure you try the shrimp. Walter. She said my name like a period at the end of a sentence, then turned and walked back toward the light. Caleb watched her go. He couldn't look at me. She's just, he started. You don't have to explain her, I said. Grandpa. Go enjoy your party, Caleb. I put my hand on his shoulder. We'll talk later. I went back to my corner table. I took the $100 bill out of my pocket and smoothed it flat on the tablecloth. A young busboy came through the kitchen doors carrying a massive tray, arms shaking, not a day over 20. He looked the way I had looked at 20, dead tired, invisible, holding the whole world up and getting no credit for it. I slid the 100 under the edge of his tray without a word. He stopped, looked down, looked at me. I put a finger to my lips. He nodded and went back through the doors. Then I turned my attention back to the room, because something had been nagging at me since I sat down, and I needed to think. Douglas Aldcroft was putting on a show. I'd been in rooms with genuinely wealthy men my entire adult life, and they didn't sweat the way Douglas was sweating tonight. They didn't check their phones with that particular micro-flinch, didn't signal the bar staff with that edge of controlled desperation. I'd seen that look on men standing at the edge of a financial cliff they'd spent months pretending didn't exist. I waited until Caleb took Madison onto the small dance floor near the terrace, and then I stood up and walked to the bar. I ordered a club soda. The man next to me, heavy-set, red-faced, expensive watch, was 3 scotches deep and had the loosened tongue that comes with it. His name was Frank Pellegrino, and within 10 minutes of casual conversation, he told me he was a real estate attorney who had done 3 closings for the Aldcroft Group in the last year. Within 15, he told me those deals had all required creative bridge financing. Within 20, he said, quieter. Between us, I don't know how Doug is floating all this. The Newport project alone has got to be bleeding him. I asked a few more questions. Frank answered most of them, then seemed to realize he'd said too much and excused himself. I stood there with my club soda, and I let the pieces fall into place. Douglas Aldcroft was drowning. He owed money, including, indirectly, to me that his cash flow couldn't service. And Madison's upcoming marriage to Caleb was not a love story. It was a lifeline. Because my grandson, though Madison didn't know this, though Renee didn't know this, though Caleb himself didn't fully understand the scope of it, was the sole named beneficiary of the Gaines Family Maritime Trust, a 7-generation vehicle that I had built over 40 years, and which currently held assets north of $300 million. That trust activated on Caleb's 30th birthday, 6 weeks away, or upon his marriage, whichever came first. The wedding was scheduled for 5 weeks from tonight. I sat back down at my corner table. I was very still. I thought about the picture frame still wrapped under Caleb's arm. I thought about a 7-year-old boy standing on the bow of a freighter with his arms spread wide. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to my attorney, a woman named Carol Basson, who had been protecting Gaines family assets for 22 years. The text said, "Call me first thing tomorrow. Due diligence on Aldcroft Group. Full exposure." Carol texted back 11 seconds later. "Already on it. You're not going to like what I've found." I put my phone away. I was going to need every ounce of patience I had left in my body. The formal dinner toasts began an hour later. Douglas Aldcroft took the microphone with the confidence of a man who has never had to question whether a room was listening. He talked about legacy. He talked about vision. He talked about the Aldcroft name as if it were carved into some permanent ledger of the universe. He talked about the extraordinary young man his daughter had chosen, glancing at Caleb with the look of a man evaluating a financial instrument rather than a future son-in-law. And then his eyes found me in the corner. It was unmistakable, the calculation that moved across his face. He'd been briefed about me, the old longshoreman grandfather, the embarrassing relation, the man in the clearance rack sport coat sitting by the kitchen door. "You know," Douglas said, his voice warm with manufactured joviality, "one of the beautiful things about a union like this one is what it says about evolution, about moving forward." He swirled his champagne. "My daughter is extraordinary. She could have chosen anyone. And she chose a young man who has the vision to leave behind." He paused just long enough, certain limitations of his past, to reach towards something greater. He lifted his glass. "Not all of us are built for this world, friends. But the ones who are God, aren't they something to watch?" The laugh that rippled through the room was polite and bloodless. Caleb stared at the tablecloth. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I did not look away from Douglas Aldcroft for 1 second. He felt it. He tried to hold my gaze and couldn't, and he turned back to the room with his champagne raised and his smile burning a little too bright. That was when I stood up, set my napkin on the table, and walked out to the parking lot. I sat in my Silverado for 40 minutes. I made 6 phone calls. Carol, my COO, a man named Jim Pruitt who had been with me for 30 years, 2 members of the Trust's advisory board, a forensic accountant named Dennis Park, who owed me a favor, and finally, a very quiet man named Sal, who had spent 20 years in commercial risk assessment and knew where bodies were buried in the New England real estate market. By the time I walked back inside, I had a picture so complete and so damning that I almost felt sorry for Douglas Aldcroft. Almost. The picture was this. The Aldcroft Group had been over-leveraged for 18 months. 3 development projects were underwater. Douglas had been quietly borrowing against personal assets, including, allegedly, equity in this very estate, to service the interest on loans he couldn't repay. The Savannah project alone had exposed him to penalties that would begin triggering in 45 days. He needed an infusion of capital so badly that his attorney had apparently told him his only realistic path was a family liquidity event. The marriage wasn't just a life choice. It was a bankruptcy strategy, and Caleb had no idea. The rest of the evening I sat in my corner and I watched Madison work the room, and I understood her now with a clinical precision that had nothing to do with anger. She was her father's instrument. Maybe she believed in Caleb in her own way. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that my grandson was being walked into a burning building by people who were planning to lock the door behind him. I stayed until the party began to thin. I waited until Caleb found a moment alone near the terrace railing, looking out at the bay. I walked up beside him and put my elbows on the rail, the way we used to do on the freighter. "You remember the Margaret Ann?" I asked. He looked at me sideways. "Your first boat. Yeah. You stood on that bow for 3 hours straight, wouldn't come down for lunch." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought if I let go I'd fall off the edge of the world. You held on anyway." He didn't say anything, but I saw his jaw tighten. "I need you to trust me for about 2 more weeks," I said. "Can you do that?" "Grandpa, what are you?" "Just trust me." I put my hand on his shoulder. "Don't sign anything. Don't move any money. Don't let anyone rush a timeline." I squeezed his shoulder once. "Can you give me 2 weeks?" He looked at me for a long time. Something passed across his face, not the closed-over ice of earlier, but the real thing underneath it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I can do that." I drove home in the dark with the salt air coming through the cracked window and the walnut picture frame riding in the passenger seat, because Caleb had quietly handed it back to me on the way out. Madison had left it on a side table. I put it on my workbench when I got home. I looked at that 7-year-old boy with his arms spread wide, and I got to work. The next 2 weeks were the quietest war I have ever fought. Carol confirmed that 2 of the entities holding Aldcroft debt were through 2 layers of holding companies, subsidiaries of Gaines Maritime Capital. I instructed her to begin the process of acquiring the remaining senior debt positions on the open market discreetly, through blind instruments, so that no one at Aldcroft's banks would see the name Gaines until I was ready for them to. Dennis Park's forensic review uncovered something worse than simple over-leveraging. Douglas had used Caleb's name, my grandson's name, his social security number, his signature on a document he'd apparently been told was a routine relationship disclosure, as a co-guarantor on a private bridge loan of $8 million taken out 4 months ago. He had forged or induced a forgery. The money had gone into the Aldcroft Group operating account the same week he'd announced the engagement publicly. When Carol showed me that document, I sat in my office for a long time and said nothing. Then I called Sal. Then I called Jim. Then I called a federal financial crimes investigator named Agent Teresa Howell, whom I had worked with years ago on a Port Authority fraud case, and I told her I needed to have a very important conversation at her earliest convenience. She met me the next morning. By the end of the second week, I held controlling interest in Douglas Aldcroft's 2 largest outstanding loan facilities. Every piece of paper that could harm my grandson had been photographed, authenticated, and transferred to federal hands. And a federal grand jury had issued sealed indictments that were sitting in a courthouse in Providence, waiting for my signal. I also arranged something else, something personal. I called the engagement party venue the same Newport estate, booked now for the rehearsal dinner, and I reserved a seat at the event. My invitation was still technically valid. Nobody had thought to rescind it, because nobody had thought for 1 second that the old longshoreman in the clearance rack sport coat would be anything other than a forgettable footnote. I ironed the same sport coat. I polished the same boots. The rehearsal dinner was smaller, 80 guests, white linen, candlelight, the bay going dark purple outside the tall windows. I arrived last and sat at the seat they'd assigned me, near the back, close to the service corridor, facing a wall. Perfect. Douglas Aldcroft was at the head table, animated and overperforming. Madison sat beside Caleb, her hand on his arm, proprietary. Renee was 3 seats down, already on her second glass of wine, already glowing with reflected importance. Caleb caught my eye from across the room. I gave him a single nod. He held my gaze for a moment and then looked away, and I could see his jaw set. The evening moved in the way these evenings do: toasts, laughter, the performance of happiness. Douglas took the floor for what he billed as a few personal words and proceeded to speak for 22 minutes about his own accomplishments, pausing occasionally to gesture toward Caleb in a way that suggested he was a promising recent acquisition. He reached the end of his remarks, held his champagne glass up, and then his eyes moved across the room and landed on me in my dark corner, and something shifted in him. I saw it the way you see weather change over open water a minute ago. It was clear, and now it isn't. He was a smart man. Not smart enough, but smart. He'd spent 2 weeks trying to close a timeline, and something had been slipping, and he hadn't been able to figure out what. He looked at me sitting in that corner in my old sport coat with my water glass, and some deep animal part of him understood that he was looking at the thing that had been slipping. He made a choice in that moment. The wrong one. He came to my table. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without being invited, and he leaned forward with a smile that was doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting. "Walter," he said, "I don't think we've really had a chance to talk." "We haven't," I agreed. "I want you to know whatever Renee has suggested about our feelings about Caleb's family, that's not from me." He shook his head, generous and magnanimous. "I think it's wonderful that Caleb has someone in his corner. That's exactly the kind of support a young man needs." He tilted his head. "Though I do think, going forward, it might be best for everyone if Caleb's relationship with the older generation." He smiled again. "Evolves. You understand. He's entering a different world now, different responsibilities. Different." He waved a hand. "Circles." I looked at him. "What I'm trying to say," he continued, leaning a little closer, dropping his voice, is that your involvement in certain financial matters, his accounts, his trust arrangements, that's going to need to simplify considerably. For his sake, we have advisors who can handle all of that much more efficiently. I kept looking at him. I'm being direct because I respect you, he said. Man to man. This is a big moment for your grandson. Don't be the thing that complicates it. The table around us had gone subtly quiet. A few nearby guests had clocked the conversation without appearing to. I reached into the inside pocket of my sport coat. I pulled out a slim leather folder, dark brown, embossed with a small seal, and I set it on the tablecloth between us. Douglas looked at the folder. He looked at the seal. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes went very still. That, I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly even, is a summary of the current debt position of the Aldcroft Group, as of this morning. The senior facility on the Savannah project, the bridge note on the Newport build, and the personal guarantee instruments. I tapped the folder once, including the one with my grandson's name on it, which he did not knowingly sign. Douglas didn't move. I own 63% of your outstanding senior debt, I said. I completed the acquisition this afternoon. The remaining positions are held by parties who have agreed to transfer on my request. I picked up my water glass. You owe me, Douglas. Not a bank. Me. And I am calling the notes. The color left his face so fast it was almost surgical. Now, I said, here is what happens next. You are going to stand up from this table, and you're going to go back to your seat, and you're going to sit quietly for the next 20 minutes, while my attorney and a federal agent, who are currently in the parking lot, finish preparing the documentation that will be served to you before this dinner ends. I held his eyes. Or you can make a scene. Your choice. You usually strike me as a man who prefers to make scenes. Douglas sat there for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up so fast he caught the tablecloth. He walked back to the head table. He sat down. He picked up his champagne and drank half of it in one motion. And Madison leaned over and said something to him, and he shook his head without looking at her. Caleb was watching me from across the room. I gave him the smallest nod. He exhaled. What happened next was quiet and swift, and utterly without mercy. Carol came through the side entrance at the 18-minute mark, accompanied by Agent Howell and 2 colleagues in plain dress. They went directly to Douglas. The conversation at the head table lasted 4 minutes. Madison stood up. Renee stood up. Caleb sat completely still with his hands flat on the table, watching everything. Douglas was escorted not in handcuffs, not yet, that would come later, in a federal building, without an audience through the service corridor and out to a waiting vehicle. He went without resistance, because Douglas Aldcroft was, at his core, a man who folded when the bluff was called. Madison stood at the head table with her champagne still in her hand, her face doing something complicated. She looked at Caleb. She looked at me. She looked at Caleb again, and then she set her champagne glass down very carefully, picked up her clutch, and walked out through the main doors without a word to anyone. 80 guests sat in near total silence. Renee sank into her chair and put her face in her hands. I pushed back from my corner table, stood up, and walked across the room. The only sound was my boots on the hardwood floor. I stopped at the head table, in front of my grandson, and I waited until he looked up at me. His eyes were full. He was working hard to keep his composure. This young man who had been circling someone else's gravity for 2 years and had just felt the pull cut out. "Stand up," I said gently. He stood up. I handed him the walnut picture frame, which I'd had in my coat the whole evening. He looked down at it, the photograph, himself at 7. Arms spread wide on the bow of the Margaret Ann, the whole gray Atlantic behind him. He couldn't speak for a moment. "You never fell off the edge," I said. He put his arms around me then, this 29-year-old man in his rehearsal dinner suit, and he held on the way he used to hold on when he was small, and the world was too large, and I was the steadiest thing in it. I held on back. The weeks that followed were hard in the way that real things are hard, not dramatic, just heavy, requiring patience and honesty, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. Caleb had a lot of questions. I answered every one of them. We spent long evenings at my kitchen table with coffee going cold between us, and I told him things I should have told him years earlier about the trust, about the companies, about why I'd kept the old truck and the old sport coat and the old workshop, because the day you forget what you were built from is the day you start mistaking the costume for the man. He asked me once, late one of those evenings, why I hadn't just told him who I was, why I hadn't defended myself at the party when Madison tucked that $100 bill into my pocket. I thought about it for a moment. Because the kind of man who needs to announce his own worth, I said, doesn't have much of it. The value was always there. I just needed you to be in a position where you could actually see it. Douglas Aldcroft was indicted on 4 federal counts of wire fraud and 1 count of inducing a fraudulent commercial signature. He pled to 2 charges in exchange for cooperation and received a sentence that meant he would be a much older and much quieter man by the time he saw a Newport Terrace again. The Aldcroft Group's assets were liquidated in receivership. A portion went to creditors, a portion by a legal arrangement Carol structured with some quiet satisfaction went into a maritime education foundation I endowed in my late wife's name. Renee came to my door 6 weeks later. She stood on my porch in the November cold with no performance in her, no angle working, just a woman who had come to say something true. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't understood. She said she thought she had been protecting Caleb from a past she was ashamed of. And she hadn't understood until it was almost too late, that the past she was ashamed of was the only part of his life that had ever been real. I made her coffee. We sat at the same kitchen table. We talked for 3 hours. Some things break and can be repaired. Some things break and become something different. What Renee and I became was different, but it was honest. And honest is the only thing worth building on. Caleb started coming to the office 2 days a week. Not because I asked him to, because he wanted to understand. He had his grandfather's hands, wide-palmed and quick, and he had something I hadn't seen in them for 2 years. Purpose. He asked good questions. He made better observations. He started staying late. One afternoon I found him in the workshop, turning a piece of walnut over in his hands, trying to figure out where to start. "You want to make something?" I asked. "I want to try." I pulled up a stool beside him, took the piece of wood, and showed him how to read the grain. If you've listened this far, friends, I want you to carry something with you today. There are people in this world who will look at the age of your truck or the brand of your jacket and decide in 30 seconds that you have nothing worth knowing. Let them. A man who mistakes the wrapper for the gift will never understand what he's holding, and that ignorance belongs entirely to him. Your job is not to announce yourself. Your job is to know yourself and to protect what matters, and to be there steady, patient, present, when the people you love finally look up and need somewhere to hold on. Don't ever let anyone make you ashamed of where you came from. The ground you were built on is the only ground that will hold you when everything else gives way. If this story meant something to you today, I'd love to hear from you, friends. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, whether you're sitting in your kitchen in the morning, or driving home from a long shift, or just taking a quiet moment for yourself somewhere. Tell me if you've ever had someone underestimate you and lived long enough to watch them understand their mistake. I read every word. Take care of yourselves. Take care of the people who matter. And don't you ever let anyone tuck $100 into your pocket and tell you to go stand in the corner. You built the corner. You built the whole room. Don't forget it.